Sometimes the quietest rooms carry the loudest truths. The doctor's voice was calm, almost gentle, but the words seemed to hang in the small examination room like something fragile and impossible to ignore. The ultrasound monitor glowed in soft blue light beside the bed, and for a moment no one spoke. Aaliyah Brooks stared at the screen without blinking, her fingers curled lightly around the thin paper sheet covering her legs. The faint rhythmic sound of the machine filled the silence, steady and quick, like distant rain tapping against a window. She had walked into the clinic expecting confusion, maybe a mistake, maybe a routine explanation that would make the strange exhaustion of the last few weeks finally make sense. Instead, the technician had paused, leaned closer to the monitor, and quietly called the doctor in. Now the room smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm plastic, and the air felt heavier than it had when she first sat down. The doctor adjusted the probe slightly and pointed gently at the screen. "There are 2 heartbeats," she said softly. For a moment Aaliyah didn't breathe. The words repeated themselves somewhere deep in her mind, as if her thoughts were trying to catch up with reality. 2 heartbeats. The small room seemed to shrink around her. Outside the clinic window, the late afternoon sun slid down the sides of downtown Chicago buildings, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Life continued beyond the glass, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside that room, something had changed forever. Aaliyah swallowed slowly, her dark eyes still fixed on the monitor where 2 tiny flickers moved in perfect rhythm. She had always imagined that if she ever heard news like this, it would arrive in a different moment of life, a moment with stability, preparation, maybe even celebration. Not here. Not now. Not like this. Her hand moved instinctively to rest on her stomach, though the gesture felt almost unreal, as if it belonged to someone else. The doctor gave her a moment before speaking again. "They're strong," she said reassuringly, glancing at the readings. "Both of them." Aaliyah closed her eyes briefly, letting the sound of the 2 rapid heartbeats settle into the quiet corners of her thoughts. It had been only a few weeks since that unexpected night, a night that had unfolded with the strange unpredictability of fate rather than intention. She had attended a charity event downtown to help a co-worker who needed volunteers. The evening had been elegant but distant from her everyday life. Crystal glasses, polished marble floors, conversations about investments and boardrooms that felt like another world entirely. That was where she had met Ethan Caldwell. Even then, she had known who he was. Everyone did. Ethan Caldwell was the face of Caldwell Global Ventures, a company whose name appeared on skyscrapers, technology conferences, and philanthropic foundations across the country. He carried the quiet authority of someone used to making decisions that shaped entire industries. Yet that night, he hadn't looked like the man from magazine covers. He had looked tired, thoughtful, almost relieved to step away from the crowd for a few minutes of quiet conversation. Their meeting had been brief and unexpected, 2 people from very different worlds sharing a rare moment of honesty without expectation. Nothing about that evening had been planned or dramatic. It had simply happened, like a chapter in a story neither of them realized had begun. And by morning they had returned to their separate lives, assuming the moment would remain exactly that, a moment. Aaliyah opened her eyes again and stared at the monitor. 2 heartbeats. The phrase still felt unreal. The doctor printed a set of ultrasound images and placed them carefully on the small tray beside the bed. "Take your time," she said kindly. "There's no rush." Aaliyah nodded faintly. Her voice hadn't quite returned yet. The clinic door opened quietly a moment later, and a nurse stepped in, whispering something to the doctor. The doctor's expression shifted slightly before she nodded and turned toward the door. "I'll be right back," she said. The nurse stepped aside as a tall figure appeared in the doorway. For a moment the room seemed to freeze again, the quiet machine still humming beside the bed. Ethan Caldwell stood just inside the threshold, his presence filling the small space without effort. He wore a dark charcoal coat over a crisp white shirt, the kind of simple but unmistakably expensive clothing that spoke of boardrooms and international flights rather than neighborhood clinics. His hair was slightly wind-tousled, as if he had arrived in a hurry, and his usually composed expression held something rarer, uncertainty. His eyes moved from the doctor to the monitor and finally to Aaliyah. Neither of them spoke for a second that felt longer than it should have. "Mr. Caldwell," the doctor began carefully, "we didn't realize. Ethan raised a hand gently, stopping her mid-sentence. His voice was low and controlled. It's all right. His gaze returned to the glowing screen. The rhythmic sound of the ultrasound filled the silence again, quick and steady. The doctor cleared her throat softly. We were just confirming the pregnancy, she explained. There are twins. Ethan's eyes sharpened slightly as if the information had reached him half a second late. The word twins lingered in the room like a quiet echo. For a moment he didn't move. Then he stepped closer, not abruptly, but with the deliberate calm of someone absorbing something significant. He looked at the screen, studying the faint shapes with an intensity that had nothing to do with business deals or corporate negotiations. The two small pulses flickered again in perfect rhythm. Aaliyah watched him carefully. She expected disbelief, maybe questions, maybe the polite distance of a man who lived in a world where problems were solved with contracts and signatures. Instead, Ethan's expression remained thoughtful, almost protective in its stillness. He finally spoke, his voice softer than before. Two, he said quietly. The doctor nodded once. Yes. The room fell silent again except for the gentle heartbeat rhythm echoing through the machine. Ethan straightened slowly, his gaze shifting from the monitor back to Aaliyah. There was no accusation in his eyes, no shock, no trace of the cold calculation the financial press often associated with him. Only quiet understanding. He glanced toward the doctor and the nurse, standing near the door. Could we have a moment? He asked calmly. The request wasn't sharp, but it carried the kind of authority that rarely needed to be repeated. The doctor hesitated only briefly before nodding. Of course. Within seconds the door closed behind them, leaving the room quiet except for the machine's steady rhythm. Aaliyah sat upright slowly, gathering the thin blanket around her shoulders as the reality of the moment settled deeper into the room. Ethan remained standing for a moment, looking at the monitor one more time before reaching over and gently lowering the volume on the machine so the heartbeat softened into the background. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried none of the cold distance people expected from powerful men. Are you all right? He asked simply. Aaliyah met his eyes. The question was so straightforward that it caught her slightly off guard. She took a slow breath before answering. I think I will be. Ethan studied her expression for another quiet second. Then he nodded once, almost to himself, as if acknowledging something unspoken. Outside the clinic window the sun slipped lower behind the skyline, and the last golden light brushed across the ultrasound images resting on the tray beside the bed. Two tiny shapes, two steady heartbeats. And in that quiet room, neither of them yet understood how much those two small pulses were about to change the direction of both their lives. The quiet inside the examination room lingered for a few seconds after Ethan lowered the volume of the ultrasound machine, but silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt heavy with awareness. Aaliyah Brooks watched the small screen where the faint shapes still flickered, and although the sound was now softer, she could still sense the rhythm in the room as if the air itself carried it. Two heartbeats. The phrase had already begun reshaping the way she looked at the world around her. Ethan Caldwell stood a few feet away near the window, his posture straight but thoughtful, the fading sunlight catching the edge of his coat. For a man whose name moved markets and whose schedule was usually measured in 15-minute increments, he did not look rushed. Instead, he seemed to be absorbing the moment with a kind of careful attention that few people ever saw from him. He finally spoke again, his tone calm but deliberate. How long have you known? Aaliyah exhaled slowly. A few days, she answered. I wanted to be sure before saying anything. Ethan nodded slightly, as if the response confirmed something he had already guessed. He stepped closer to the small tray where the printed ultrasound photos rested. He did not pick them up immediately. Instead, he studied them from where he stood, his eyes tracing the faint outlines that represented two separate lives just beginning to form. In the world Ethan Caldwell usually inhabited, numbers on a screen represented growth, risk, opportunity. But these small images were different. They were not projections or forecasts. They were real. Aaliyah watched his expression carefully. She had expected questions about timing, about responsibility, perhaps even about discretion. The man standing in front of her was a billionaire executive known for precision and control. Yet his silence did not feel like calculation. It felt more like reflection. I did not expect this, Ethan said quietly. The statement was simple, but it carried no blame. Aaliyah gave a small, honest smile that lasted only a second. Neither did I. The late afternoon light outside the window softened as clouds moved across the sky, dimming the brightness in the room. Ethan finally reached down and picked up one of the ultrasound prints. He held it carefully between two fingers, examining it with a focus that suggested he understood the importance of small details. "The doctor said they are healthy," he said after a moment. "That matters." Aaliyah nodded. Her hand rested lightly on her stomach again, though the movement was instinctive rather than dramatic. "It does." Another quiet pause settled between them. Ethan set the image back on the tray before turning toward her fully. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "You do not need to handle this alone." The statement was direct, but not forceful. Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, considering his words before answering. "I have handled most things alone in my life," she said calmly. "It is not new to me." Ethan studied her expression, noticing the steadiness in her voice. There was no resentment in it, only a kind of quiet independence that he respected immediately. "That may be true," he replied, "but it does not mean you should have to." Aaliyah looked toward the ultrasound monitor again, where the faint outlines still glowed softly. "And what exactly are you offering?" she asked. Ethan did not answer immediately. He walked to the small chair beside the examination table and sat down, resting his hands together in front of him. It was a posture far removed from the commanding stance he used in boardrooms. Here he looked more like a man considering a personal decision rather than a corporate strategy. "Support," he said finally. "Medical care. Stability. Whatever is necessary to make sure you and the babies are safe and comfortable." The way he said the word babies sounded unfamiliar in his voice, but not unwelcome. Aaliyah considered his words carefully. She had expected something like this. Money solved most problems in Ethan Caldwell's world. But the way he spoke made it clear he was trying to approach the situation differently. "Support is not the same as control," she said gently. Ethan met her gaze. "I understand the difference." She searched his face for a moment, weighing the sincerity behind his calm expression. Outside the clinic, the muted sounds of traffic drifted faintly through the glass as the city continued its ordinary rhythm. Inside the room, however, time seemed slower. "If you are thinking about contracts or arrangements," Aaliyah continued quietly, "I am not interested in that kind of solution." Ethan shook his head almost immediately. "Neither am I." The answer came without hesitation, and that alone surprised her. He leaned back slightly in the chair, glancing once more at the ultrasound monitor before returning his attention to her. "You deserve respect," he said. "And so do they." He gestured gently toward the screen. The simplicity of the statement settled into the room with quiet weight. Aaliyah felt something unexpected ease in her chest. She had spent the last few days preparing herself for difficult conversations, for negotiations that might make the situation feel transactional. Instead, she was hearing something different. Ethan stood again after a moment, adjusting the cuff of his shirt in a small, absent gesture. "There will be practical things to consider," he continued. "Doctors, living arrangements, time off work. I can help with those details if you allow it." Aaliyah watched him carefully. "Help does not mean ownership," she repeated. Ethan nodded once. "Agreed." The door outside the room creaked faintly as someone passed down the hallway, reminding them that the world beyond this conversation was still moving. Ethan walked back toward the window, looking out briefly at the fading skyline before speaking again. "My life tends to move quickly," he said. "Decisions, travel, meetings. But this is not something I intend to treat like another item on a calendar." Aaliyah gave a faint smile at that. "That is good to hear." Ethan turned back toward her, his expression thoughtful. "What do you need right now?" The question was simple but sincere. Aaliyah took a moment before answering. "Time," she said. "And honesty." Ethan considered the request. "Both are reasonable." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small white envelope, placing it gently on the tray beside the ultrasound photos. "This is not a contract," he explained. "It covers the next round of medical appointments. Nothing more." Aaliyah glanced at the envelope but did not touch it. "You are very certain I will accept it?" Ethan shook his head slightly. "No, I am certain you will decide what feels right." The quiet confidence in his voice made the moment feel balanced rather than pressured. Aaliyah studied the envelope for another second before finally picking it up and turning it in her hands. She did not open it yet. Instead, she looked back at him. "Respect," she said thoughtfully. You used that word earlier. Ethan nodded. I meant it. Aaliyah placed the envelope back beside the ultrasound photos, her expression calm. Then we start there. Ethan's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if an invisible tension had eased. Outside, the sky had shifted into the soft colors of early evening, and the city lights were beginning to glow across the skyline. Inside the quiet clinic room, the faint rhythm of 2 small heartbeats continued on the screen, steady and unhurried, marking the beginning of a story neither of them had planned, but both of them were now part of. Aaliyah Brooks left the clinic just as the evening air of Chicago turned cooler, the kind of early autumn breeze that carried the scent of traffic, distant food trucks, and the faint metallic smell of the nearby river. The glass doors closed behind her with a quiet click, and for a moment she stood still on the sidewalk, one hand resting lightly on the strap of her bag, while the other settled unconsciously over her stomach. The city moved around her in its usual rhythm. Cars rolled past. A bus hissed to a stop across the street. 2 office workers laughed as they crossed the corner carrying takeout containers. No one around her knew that 2 tiny heartbeats had just changed the direction of her life. The ultrasound photo rested inside her bag beside the envelope Ethan had placed on the tray. She had not opened it yet. She was not even sure if she would tonight. What mattered more was the conversation that had just taken place inside that quiet room. Ethan Caldwell had not reacted the way she expected. There had been no pressure, no cold legal language, no attempt to reduce the situation into a negotiation. Instead, he had spoken about respect. That word echoed in her thoughts as she began walking toward the bus stop at the corner. Respect. It sounded simple, but in Aaliyah's life, simple things often carried the greatest weight. A black sedan was parked along the curb half a block away, its polished surface reflecting the streetlights beginning to glow as dusk settled across the skyline. Inside the car, Ethan sat quietly in the back seat, his phone resting untouched beside him. The driver waited patiently at the wheel, glancing occasionally in the rearview mirror but saying nothing. Ethan watched through the tinted glass as Aaliyah walked down the sidewalk, her steps steady, her shoulders straight despite the quiet storm of change that must be unfolding inside her mind. He admired that steadiness more than he expected. In his world, people often reacted to unexpected news with urgency, emotion, or calculation. Aaliyah had responded with something different. Dignity. The driver finally spoke softly. Sir, the board call begins in 20 minutes. Ethan nodded without taking his eyes off the sidewalk. I know. He still did not reach for his phone. Instead, he leaned back slightly in the seat and exhaled slowly. The image of the ultrasound screen remained vivid in his mind. 2 faint pulses of light moving in perfect rhythm. 2 heartbeats. It was remarkable how quickly something so small could rearrange a person's priorities. The sedan pulled away from the curb a moment later, merging smoothly into traffic as the downtown lights brightened against the darkening sky. Meanwhile, Aaliyah reached the bus stop and sat down on the metal bench, the cool surface pressing through the thin fabric of her coat. She placed her bag beside her and finally removed the ultrasound photo, holding the small print carefully in both hands. Under the glow of the streetlight, the image looked almost abstract, 2 tiny shapes floating within soft gray shadows. Yet she understood exactly what they represented. 2 lives depending on her strength. A quiet determination settled over her expression as she studied the image. She had faced uncertainty before. She had balanced 2 part-time jobs while helping her mother through months of medical treatments. She had navigated rooms where people underestimated her because of her background or the color of her skin. None of that had broken her. This would not either. The bus arrived a few minutes later with the familiar squeal of brakes, and Aaliyah climbed aboard, tapping her transit card against the scanner before taking a seat near the window. The ride north through the city felt longer than usual tonight, not because of traffic, but because her thoughts were moving faster than the streets outside. Ethan Caldwell. The name alone carried weight in Chicago's business world. She had known that the night they met, but the evening had not felt like an encounter with a billionaire executive. It had felt like 2 people sharing a conversation that neither expected to matter beyond that moment. Now everything was different. She glanced down at the envelope still resting in her bag. Support, he had called it, not control. She appreciated the distinction, but she also knew that accepting help from someone like Ethan meant stepping into a world far larger than her own. The bus passed under the steel tracks of the elevated train, the rumble overhead vibrating through the seats. Aaliyah watched the familiar streets of her neighborhood come into view as the bus approached her stop. The modest brick buildings, the small grocery store on the corner, the laundromat with its flickering sign. These places represented the life she understood. As she stepped off the bus and walked the final block toward her apartment building, she noticed the warm light glowing in the front window. Her mother was awake. That was not surprising. Mrs. Brooks had always been a light sleeper since her treatments began months earlier. Aaliyah opened the door quietly and stepped inside the small apartment, the comforting smell of herbal tea drifting from the kitchen. Her mother looked up from the table with a gentle smile that carried both curiosity and concern. "You were at the doctor longer than expected," she said softly. Aaliyah removed her coat and set her bag on the chair before sitting across from her. For a moment, she simply looked at her mother, gathering the right words. Then she reached into her bag and placed the ultrasound photo carefully on the table between them. Mrs. Brooks leaned forward slightly, adjusting her reading glasses as she studied the small image. The silence lasted only a few seconds before her eyes widened with understanding. "Two?" she asked quietly. Aaliyah nodded once. Her mother leaned back in the chair slowly, absorbing the information the way only someone with years of life experience could. There was surprise in her expression, but not fear. Instead, there was a thoughtful calm. "Life has a way of arriving when it chooses," she said. Gently. Aaliyah smiled faintly at that familiar wisdom. "That it does." Mrs. Brooks studied her daughter for another moment. "Does the father know?" Aaliyah hesitated briefly before answering. "Yes." Her mother's eyebrows lifted slightly. "And?" Aaliyah rested her hands together on the table. "He said he wants to help." Mrs. Brooks glanced again at the ultrasound photo before looking back at her daughter. "And what do you want?" The question was simple but meaningful. Aaliyah took a slow breath before answering. "I want them to grow up knowing that they were welcomed into the world with respect," she said quietly. Her mother nodded, clearly satisfied with the answer. Outside the apartment window, the distant sounds of the city continued, steady and familiar. Inside the small kitchen, the warm light reflected softly off the ultrasound photo resting between them. Two small shapes, two steady heartbeats. And though neither Aaliyah nor Ethan fully understood it yet, the choices they were beginning to make tonight would shape far more than their own futures. Morning arrived slowly over Chicago, pale sunlight stretching between the tall buildings and slipping through the narrow kitchen window of the Brooks apartment. The city had not fully woken yet. Somewhere down the block a delivery truck rumbled past, and the distant sound of a train echoed along the steel tracks overhead. Aaliyah Brooks stood by the small stove stirring oatmeal in a saucepan while the quiet rhythm of the morning settled around her. The ultrasound image rested on the kitchen counter beside a ceramic mug, the paper slightly curled from the humidity of the room. She glanced at it again without meaning to. Two small shapes. Two steady promises of life that had already begun to change how she moved, how she thought, how she planned each hour of the day ahead. Her mother sat at the small kitchen table wrapped in a soft gray sweater, sipping herbal tea and watching her daughter with the calm patience of someone who understood that life's biggest changes often arrived quietly. "You did not sleep much," Mrs. Brooks said gently. Aaliyah gave a small smile as she poured the oatmeal into two bowls. "I slept enough." That answer was only partly true. Her mind had been busy most of the night, moving through questions that did not yet have answers. Ethan Caldwell's face had appeared more than once in those thoughts, not as the billionaire executive whose name filled business magazines, but as the thoughtful man who had stood quietly beside the ultrasound monitor and lowered the volume so the sound would not overwhelm the room. Respect. The word still lingered in her memory. After breakfast, she gathered her bag and prepared to leave for work. Her job at a community resource center downtown did not come with luxury or recognition, but it came with purpose. The center helped families navigate housing applications, medical assistance, and employment resources. It was the kind of place where every small effort mattered. As she stepped outside into the cool morning air, the sky above the city was a clear pale blue. Aaliyah pulled her coat tighter and walked toward the bus stop, her thoughts steady but focused. She had responsibilities now that reached beyond her own future. Across town, the headquarters of Caldwell Global Ventures stood like a polished mirror against the skyline, its glass facade reflecting the rising sun. Inside the 43rd floor boardroom, Ethan Caldwell sat at the head of a long table surrounded by advisors, executives, and financial analysts who were presenting quarterly projections. Large screens glowed along the walls with graphs and numbers that would normally command his full attention. Yet today his mind drifted more than usual. Our growth forecast for the next fiscal quarter shows strong expansion in the technology division, one analyst explained while pointing at a digital chart. Ethan nodded politely, though his thoughts briefly returned to the quiet clinic room from the previous evening. 2 heartbeats. The phrase had followed him home and into the early hours of the morning. It had been years since something outside the business world had shifted his attention so completely. Mr. Caldwell? The analyst paused, waiting. Ethan blinked once and refocused on the presentation. Continue, he said calmly. The meeting moved forward, but something about the numbers felt distant today. By mid-morning, Ethan's assistant, Daniel Harper, approached him outside the boardroom carrying a tablet. There are several calls waiting for you, Daniel said efficiently. Also, the foundation director would like to confirm the hospital partnership announcement scheduled next week. Ethan took the tablet, but did not immediately scroll through the messages. Daniel, he said thoughtfully, how many of our healthcare initiatives involve maternal care programs? Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly, surprised by the sudden question. A few, he replied. But most of our healthcare funding focuses on pediatric research and medical technology development. Ethan nodded slowly, as if considering something deeper. Expand the maternal care research grants, he said quietly. Particularly programs focused on prenatal support. Daniel typed quickly into the tablet. I will coordinate with the foundation team. Ethan turned toward the large window overlooking the city streets far below. The movement of cars and people looked almost peaceful from that height. Responsibility came in many forms. Some were financial, some were personal. Meanwhile, across the city, Aaliyah stepped into the community center where the morning routine had already begun. Phones rang softly at the front desk. Volunteers organized stacks of paperwork. The familiar environment brought her a sense of grounding that she appreciated. Her coworker Jasmine noticed her immediately. You look thoughtful today, Jasmine said while handing her a folder. Aaliyah smiled faintly. Just a lot on my mind. Jasmine laughed softly. Welcome to adulthood. Aaliyah took the folder and moved toward her desk, but the ultrasound image in her bag reminded her that adulthood had just expanded in ways she never imagined. Late in the afternoon, her phone vibrated quietly in her pocket while she reviewed housing applications for a local family. She stepped into the hallway and answered the call. Hello, Aaliyah. Ethan's voice came through the phone, calm and clear. She paused for a moment, slightly surprised but not uncomfortable. Hello. There was a brief silence as if both of them were adjusting to this new connection. I hope I am not interrupting your work, Ethan said politely. It is all right, she replied. What is on your mind? Ethan took a breath before answering. I wanted to ask if you had scheduled your next appointment with the doctor. Aaliyah leaned lightly against the wall, considering the question. Not yet, she said honestly. I was planning to call tomorrow. Allow me to arrange it, Ethan offered. Only the logistics. The decision is always yours. His careful wording made her smile slightly. You remember what I said about respect, she said gently. I do, he answered. Aaliyah glanced down the hallway where the quiet activity of the community center continued. Life here moved at a slower, more human pace than the corporate world Ethan came from. Yet somehow the conversation between them bridged that distance. You may help with the appointment, she said finally. But I will still choose the doctor. Ethan's voice carried a hint of approval. That sounds fair. Another small pause followed. Neither of them rushed to end the conversation. Aaliyah, Ethan said after a moment. I know this situation is unexpected for both of us, but I want you to know that I intend to approach it with integrity. She looked out the window at the busy Chicago street below. Integrity is a strong word, she replied quietly. It is also the right one, Ethan said. When the call ended a few seconds later, Aaliyah returned to her desk feeling slightly different than before. The path ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was becoming clearer with each passing hour. The future was no longer something she would face alone. And somewhere across the city, in an office tower of glass and steel, Ethan Caldwell stood at the window again, watching the movement of Chicago below, while the quiet memory of 2 steady heartbeats continued to reshape the direction of his life. The following morning carried a calm that felt different from the days before, not quieter but more deliberate, as if the city itself had slowed just enough to allow Aaliyah Brooks to notice the subtle changes happening inside her life. The air outside her apartment building held the crisp coolness of early fall, and the sky above Chicago stretched wide and pale blue between rows of brick and glass. She walked steadily toward the bus stop with her bag over one shoulder, the ultrasound photo still tucked carefully inside its small envelope. The simple image had already become something more than a medical record. It was a reminder that every decision from this point forward carried a deeper meaning. At the Caldwell Global headquarters downtown, Ethan Caldwell stepped out of a private elevator onto the executive floor where the quiet hum of productivity had already begun for the day. Assistants moved with efficient purpose, screens glowed with schedules and reports, and the distant murmur of meetings filled the glass corridors. Yet Ethan's pace was slower than usual as he crossed the hallway toward his office. The conversation he had shared with Aaliyah the previous afternoon lingered in his thoughts with surprising clarity. Her voice had carried strength without confrontation, independence without distance. Respect had not been a negotiation with her. It had been a boundary. Inside his office, the large windows framed a sweeping view of the Chicago skyline. Ethan set his briefcase on the desk and loosened his tie slightly before turning toward the glass. The city stretched for miles below, the movement of traffic and people appearing almost peaceful from 40 floors above the street. Daniel Harper knocked lightly before stepping inside with his tablet. "Your schedule is prepared for the morning," Daniel said. "There is also confirmation from the clinic you requested." Ethan turned toward him immediately. "They have an appointment available tomorrow afternoon," Daniel continued. "The physician specializes in high-risk prenatal care and maternal health. One of the best in the state." Ethan nodded once, satisfied. "Schedule it," he said. Daniel typed quickly into the tablet before pausing. "Will Ms. Brooks be notified directly?" Ethan considered the question for a moment. "Send her the details," he replied calmly. "But make it clear that the choice remains hers." Daniel gave a small nod of understanding before leaving the office. Across the city, Aaliyah had just finished assisting a young couple at the community center who were trying to secure housing assistance for their newborn son. As she walked them through the paperwork, she noticed the way the young mother held the baby close against her shoulder, instinctively protective. The sight stirred something quiet and powerful in Aaliyah's chest. Two small lives were growing inside her now. Two futures that would depend on her choices and her courage. After the couple left, Jasmine leaned against the edge of Aaliyah's desk with a curious smile. "You have been very thoughtful lately," she said. "Something going on?" Aaliyah hesitated before answering. She trusted Jasmine, but the news still felt new and delicate. "Life is changing a little faster than I expected," she said gently. Jasmine raised an eyebrow, but respected the hint that the conversation would remain brief for now. "Well," she said lightly, "sometimes fast changes turn into the best stories later." Aaliyah smiled faintly at that before returning to the paperwork in front of her. Her phone vibrated quietly a few minutes later with a message notification. She glanced down and saw a short message from an unfamiliar number. The text contained a time, an address, and the name of a prenatal specialist. At the bottom was a simple line. "This appointment is available tomorrow if it works for you. Ethan." Aaliyah studied the message for a moment before placing the phone on the desk. The offer was thoughtful and respectful, exactly the way he had promised. Yet she also understood the importance of choosing her own path. After a few minutes, she picked up the phone again and typed a short response. "Tomorrow works. Thank you for arranging it." Her message was simple, but it carried the quiet acknowledgement that cooperation could exist without surrendering independence. In his office, Ethan read the response a few minutes later and allowed himself the faintest smile before returning to the stack of reports waiting on his desk. The afternoon moved quickly for both of them. Meetings, paperwork, and responsibilities continued to fill their schedules the way ordinary days often did. Yet beneath those routines, something new was quietly unfolding. By early evening, the city lights began to flicker on across the skyline, and the temperature dropped enough to send a cool breeze through the downtown streets. Ethan left the office building shortly after sunset and stepped into the waiting black sedan. As the car pulled into traffic, he looked out the window at the passing neighborhoods and thought again about the conversation he would have with Aaliyah tomorrow at the clinic. Responsibility was no longer an abstract concept. It had become personal. Meanwhile, Aaliyah finished her shift at the community center and stepped outside into the evening air, pulling her coat around her shoulders as she walked toward the bus stop. Her thoughts were calm but focused. The appointment tomorrow would be another step forward into the unknown, but it would also bring clarity. When she reached her apartment later that night, her mother was sitting by the window reading a paperback novel. Mrs. Brooks looked up with a warm expression as Aaliyah entered. "You look thoughtful again," she said gently. Aaliyah placed her bag on the table and removed the envelope containing the ultrasound image. "I have another doctor appointment tomorrow," she explained. Her mother closed the book and set it aside. "And how do you feel about that?" Aaliyah took a slow breath before answering. "I feel ready to keep moving forward." Mrs. Brooks studied her daughter's face with quiet pride. "That is all anyone can do," she said softly. The apartment grew quiet as the evening settled around them. Outside the window, the city continued its steady rhythm. Cars moving through intersections and distant lights reflecting. Along the river, inside the small kitchen, the ultrasound photo rested on the table under the warm glow of a single lamp. Two tiny shapes, two steady heartbeats. And though the future remained uncertain, both Aaliyah Brooks and Ethan Caldwell were beginning to understand that the lives forming quietly between their worlds would soon connect those worlds in ways neither of them could fully predict. The next afternoon arrived with a soft gray sky stretching over Chicago, the kind of quiet daylight that made the city feel slower and more reflective than usual. Aaliyah Brooks stepped out of the bus and walked toward the medical building where the appointment had been scheduled, her coat buttoned neatly against the cool wind that moved through the downtown streets. The glass entrance doors reflected the passing traffic behind her, and for a brief moment, she paused outside before stepping in. Not because she felt uncertain, but because she understood that each visit to this place carried meaning now. Each appointment would mark another step in a journey that had begun unexpectedly, yet already felt deeply real. Inside the lobby, the soft hum of conversation and the quiet tapping of keyboards created the familiar rhythm of a medical office. Aaliyah approached the reception desk and gave her name. The receptionist smiled politely before checking the schedule on the computer screen. "You are right on time," she said warmly. "The doctor will see you shortly." Aaliyah nodded and moved to a chair near the large window overlooking the street. From there she could see the movement of the city below. People crossed intersections, taxis pulled up to curbs, and a delivery driver carefully carried boxes into a nearby building. Life continued with its usual pace. A few minutes later, the elevator doors opened behind her, and Ethan Caldwell stepped into the waiting area. He was dressed in a dark navy coat and a simple white shirt without a tie, his presence noticeable yet calm. The receptionist looked up briefly but said nothing. In a city like Chicago, many powerful figures passed quietly through professional spaces every day. Ethan spotted Aaliyah near the window and walked over, his steps measured and respectful. "Good afternoon," he said softly. Aaliyah looked up and gave a small nod. "You made it." Ethan sat in the chair beside hers, but kept a comfortable distance. "I wanted to be here," he replied simply. The waiting room remained peaceful as a nurse called another patient through the hallway. Ethan rested his hands loosely together while glancing out the window. "How are you feeling today?" he asked after a moment. Aaliyah considered the question honestly. "Stronger than yesterday," she said. "That is good," Ethan answered quietly. The conversation paused for a moment as both of them watched the city outside. It was an unusual scene in many ways. One of the most influential business leaders in the country sitting quietly in a medical waiting room beside a woman whose life had been built through resilience rather than wealth. Yet the difference in their worlds seemed smaller here than it did anywhere else. The nurse appeared at the door and called Aaliyah's name. Aaliyah stood and adjusted her coat before turning toward Ethan. "You can wait here if you prefer," she said. Ethan stood as well. "If it is acceptable to you, I would like to come with you." Aaliyah studied his expression briefly before nodding. "That is fine." The examination room was bright and quiet, the same calm medical environment that had already become familiar to Aaliyah. The doctor greeted them with a friendly smile and introduced herself before reviewing the chart on the tablet in her hand. "We will begin with a routine examination today," she explained. "Because this is a twin pregnancy, we will monitor your health carefully to make sure everything continues to develop well." Aaliyah listened attentively while Ethan remained quietly beside the wall, observing the process without interrupting. The doctor asked a few questions about Aaliyah's health history and daily routines, making notes as she spoke. Then the ultrasound equipment was prepared again, the soft glow of the screen lighting the room as the examination began. The familiar image appeared gradually on the monitor, the small shapes moving gently within the quiet gray space. The doctor adjusted the probe slightly and smiled. "Both heartbeats are strong," she said. The rhythmic sound filled the room once more, clearer now than it had been during the previous appointment. Ethan stood still for a moment as he listened. The sound was small but steady, like a quiet promise repeating itself again and again. Aaliyah looked at the screen with calm focus. The first time she had seen the image, she had been surprised by the reality of it. Now the sight brought something different. Confidence. The doctor printed several updated images and handed them to Aaliyah. "Everything looks healthy so far," she said reassuringly. "We will continue regular checkups every few weeks." After the examination finished, the doctor stepped out briefly to finalize the appointment notes, leaving Aaliyah and Ethan alone in the room again. The quiet that followed felt thoughtful rather than uncertain. Ethan glanced at the ultrasound images in Aaliyah's hands. "They seem determined already," he said with a faint smile. Aaliyah laughed softly. "They might be." Ethan leaned lightly against the counter, his posture relaxed in a way that few people in his corporate world ever saw. "You handled today with remarkable calm," he said. "It is easier when you know what to expect," Aaliyah replied. Ethan nodded once before speaking again. "There are practical things I would like to discuss when you feel ready," he said carefully. "Living arrangements, transportation, access to medical care. Not because I believe you cannot manage them yourself, but because you should not have to carry everything alone." Aaliyah looked at the ultrasound images again before responding. "We can discuss those things," she said thoughtfully. "But slowly." Ethan agreed immediately. "Slowly is acceptable." Aaliyah placed the images carefully back into her bag. "There is one thing that matters most to me," she continued. Ethan waited quietly. "These children deserve stability," she said. "They deserve to grow up knowing that their lives were respected from the beginning." Ethan's expression softened with understanding. "That is exactly what I want as well." The doctor returned a moment later with the printed report and confirmed the next appointment date. As Aaliyah and Ethan left the room together, the hallway outside felt brighter than before. Not because anything dramatic had changed, but because the path forward was becoming clearer. When they stepped back into the waiting area, the afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, casting long reflections across the polished floor. Outside the building, the wind carried the distant sound of the city moving through its daily rhythm. Ethan paused beside the entrance doors before speaking again. "Thank you for allowing me to be here today," he said sincerely. Aaliyah looked at him for a moment before answering. "Respect works both ways," she said. Ethan nodded once in quiet agreement. And as they stepped outside into the cool Chicago air together, the future that had once seemed uncertain now felt like something that could be built carefully, one steady heartbeat at a time. The afternoon light outside the medical building softened into a quiet golden glow as Aaliyah Brooks and Ethan Caldwell stepped onto the sidewalk together. The wind carried the faint scent of roasted coffee from a nearby cafe, and the city traffic moved steadily through the downtown streets. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The appointment had gone well, and the calm reassurance from the doctor still lingered in the air between them. Aaliyah adjusted the strap of her bag where the new ultrasound images rested safely inside. Each visit seemed to make the reality clearer, more grounded. Ethan stood beside her with his hands loosely in his coat pockets, watching the movement of the city with thoughtful eyes. "There is a cafe just across the street," he said after a moment, his voice relaxed but careful. "Would you be comfortable sitting down for a few minutes?" Aaliyah followed his gaze toward the small corner cafe where warm light glowed through the windows and people moved quietly inside. She considered the idea before nodding. That would be fine. They crossed the street together, waiting patiently for the signal before stepping onto the crosswalk. The city around them moved with its usual rhythm, yet the simple act of walking side by side felt different now. Not dramatic, not rushed, but quietly meaningful. Inside the cafe, the scent of fresh coffee and warm pastries created a comforting atmosphere. Soft music played from speakers near the ceiling, and the low murmur of conversation filled the space. Ethan held the door open for Aaliyah before they stepped inside, and chose a small table near the window. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the glass, reflecting off the polished wooden surface of the table between them. Aaliyah ordered a cup of herbal tea while Ethan requested a simple black coffee. Neither of them seemed interested in rushing the moment. When they sat down again, the city outside continued moving in the background like a distant painting of everyday life. Ethan rested his hands lightly on the table while studying her expression. "You handled the appointment well," he said. "Many people would have felt overwhelmed." Aaliyah smiled gently. "Life has already taught me how to stay calm when things change quickly." Ethan nodded with quiet respect. "That is something I noticed about you from the beginning." The tea arrived a moment later, steam rising softly from the cup as Aaliyah wrapped her hands around it. The warmth felt comforting against the coolness of the afternoon air outside. Ethan stirred his coffee thoughtfully before speaking again. "I would like to talk about something important," he said carefully. Aaliyah looked up from her tea. "Go ahead." Ethan took a slow breath before continuing. "Your apartment is comfortable, but raising twins will require more space and resources. I want to make sure you have access to everything you need." Aaliyah listened quietly without interrupting. She had expected a conversation like this eventually. Ethan continued in a calm and respectful tone. "I am not suggesting that you give up your independence, but I would like to help create an environment where you and the babies can thrive." Aaliyah considered his words carefully before responding. "You were talking about housing." Ethan nodded once. "Yes." She leaned back slightly in the chair and looked out the cafe window at the movement of people along the sidewalk. The offer was generous, but she knew the importance of maintaining her own sense of agency. "If we discuss something like that," she said slowly, "it has to be done in a way that does not turn my life into something that feels controlled." Ethan met her gaze with steady sincerity. "Control is not what I want," he replied. "Stability is." Aaliyah studied his expression for a moment before nodding. "Then we can explore options." Ethan relaxed slightly, appreciating her openness to the conversation. "There are several properties near the lake that offer quiet neighborhoods and access to excellent medical facilities," he explained. "But the choice would always be yours." Aaliyah smiled faintly. "You really do listen." Ethan returned the small smile. "Listening is a useful skill in business and in life." The conversation paused for a moment while the sounds of the cafe filled the space around them. Aaliyah took another sip of her tea and glanced down at the envelope containing the ultrasound images. The presence of those images reminded her of the real purpose behind these discussions. "There is another thing we should talk about," she said gently. Ethan leaned forward slightly, attentive. "What is that?" "The future," Aaliyah replied. "Not just where the babies will live, but how they will understand their family." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "That is an important conversation." Aaliyah looked directly at him. "They deserve honesty," she said. "From both of us." Ethan held her gaze for a moment before answering. "I agree completely." The sincerity in his voice carried weight. Aaliyah felt a quiet reassurance settle inside her chest. The future was still uncertain, but the foundation of respect between them continued to grow stronger. Outside the cafe, the afternoon light began to shift toward evening as the sun lowered behind the tall buildings of downtown Chicago. The streets filled with the steady flow of people leaving offices and heading toward trains, buses, and homes across the city. Inside the cafe, the conversation between Aaliyah Brooks and Ethan Caldwell continued with the calm patience of two people learning how their worlds could exist together. They spoke about practical matters first: medical schedules, transportation, and flexible work arrangements. Ethan offered resources without pressure, and Aaliyah accepted the ones that made sense while maintaining her own independence. The balance between them remained steady. After some time, Ethan glanced at his watch, but made no move to leave. "There is one more thing I would like to say," he added quietly. Aaliyah waited. Ethan's voice carried a tone of quiet conviction. "These children are not a complication in my life. They are a responsibility that I take seriously." Aaliyah studied his expression carefully. "Responsibility can mean many things," she said. Ethan nodded once. "To me it means presence," he replied. "It means showing up when it matters." The simplicity of the statement stayed with her for a moment. Aaliyah finally smiled again, a little warmer this time. "Then we will see how well you keep that promise." Ethan returned the smile with calm confidence. "I intend to." As they finished their drinks and prepared to leave the cafe, the evening lights of Chicago began glowing brighter across the skyline. Outside the window, the city continued its endless rhythm, unaware that two people sitting quietly inside had just taken another step toward building a shared future centered around two small heartbeats that had already begun changing everything. The evening air outside the cafe carried a gentle chill as Aaliyah Brooks and Ethan Caldwell stepped back onto the sidewalk, the warm glow from the windows fading behind them as the city lights of Chicago began to take over the skyline. Traffic flowed steadily along the avenue, headlights reflecting across the glass surfaces of nearby buildings, while people hurried past wrapped in coats and scarves. For a moment, Aaliyah paused near the curb and looked out at the movement of the city, her thoughts calm but deeply aware of the quiet shift that had taken place during the conversation inside. The discussion about housing and stability had not felt like a negotiation. It had felt like planning. Ethan stood beside her with his hands resting lightly in the pockets of his coat, his posture relaxed but attentive as if he understood that the next step forward would come slowly and carefully. "Your bus stop is in that direction, correct?" he asked after a moment, nodding toward the corner where a small shelter stood beneath a street lamp. Aaliyah followed his gaze and nodded. "Yes, just 2 blocks." Ethan glanced briefly toward the traffic before speaking again. "Allow me to walk with you." Aaliyah studied him for a second before agreeing with a quiet smile. "That would be fine." They began walking together along the sidewalk, their pace unhurried as the city continued its steady rhythm around them. The cool breeze moved gently between the buildings, carrying the faint sound of distant music from a restaurant patio somewhere down the street. As they walked, Ethan spoke again, his voice calm and reflective. "When I was younger," he said, "I believed success meant control over every outcome." Aaliyah glanced at him with curiosity. "And now?" Ethan looked ahead toward the lights of the next intersection. "Now I understand that some of the most important parts of life arrive without warning." Aaliyah considered his words as they approached the bus stop. "That sounds like wisdom gained through experience." Ethan gave a small nod. "Experience and a few surprises along the way." They reached the shelter just as another bus passed through the intersection, its interior lights glowing warmly against the evening sky. The bus Aaliyah needed would arrive in a few minutes, and the quiet pause allowed them both a moment to reflect on the path ahead. Ethan leaned lightly against the metal railing beside the shelter. "I spoke with my assistant earlier today," he said thoughtfully. "There are several neighborhoods near the lake that offer quiet residential spaces and access to excellent healthcare facilities." Aaliyah listened without interrupting, her arms folded comfortably against the cool air. "Would you be open to visiting a few of those places later this week?" he continued. Aaliyah took a moment before answering. "I am open to seeing them," she said. "But I want to make sure that wherever I live still feels like my home, not just a place that was chosen for me." Ethan met her gaze with steady understanding. "That is exactly how it should be." Aaliyah appreciated the ease of the conversation. Nothing about it felt rushed or forced. They were learning how to move forward together without losing the balance that had formed between them. After a few seconds, she asked a question of her own. "What about your schedule?" Ethan smiled faintly. "My schedule has always been full," he admitted. "But I am learning that priorities can change." Aaliyah tilted her head slightly. "You make that sound simple." Ethan chuckled softly. "It is not simple, but it is necessary." The sound of another approaching bus echoed down the street, its headlights cutting through the evening traffic as it slowed toward the stop. Aaliyah stepped forward slightly, but paused when Ethan spoke again. "Before you go," he said quietly, "there is something else I want you to know." She turned to face him. "What is it?" Ethan's voice remained calm, but sincere. "I understand that trust takes time," he said, "and I am prepared to earn it." Aaliyah studied his expression carefully. The sincerity there was unmistakable. She nodded once, her voice gentle but confident. "Then we will take this one step at a time." The bus doors opened with a soft hiss, and Aaliyah stepped onto the first stair before turning back briefly. Ethan remained standing near the shelter, the city lights reflecting softly behind him. "Good night, Ethan," she said. "Good night, Aaliyah," he replied. As the bus pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic, Aaliyah took a seat by the window and looked out at the passing streets. The city seemed different tonight, not because it had changed, but because she was beginning to see her place within it more clearly. Meanwhile, Ethan remained at the bus stop for a moment longer, watching the bus disappear into the steady flow of traffic before turning toward his waiting car parked further down the block. When he reached the sedan, The driver opened the door with a respectful nod. Ethan stepped inside and settled into the back seat. As the vehicle pulled smoothly into the street, the skyline of Chicago glowed across the horizon, each building lit with thousands of windows that reflected the endless activity of the city below. Ethan leaned back slightly and looked out at the lights, his thoughts returning once again to the ultrasound image he had seen earlier that day. 2 small heartbeats, 2 lives quietly forming in the world. For years his decisions had been measured by profit margins, investments, and long-term strategies. Now another measure had begun to take shape. Responsibility. Not the kind that appeared in financial reports or board meetings, but the kind that shaped a person's character over time. Across the city, Aaliyah's bus continued its route north through familiar neighborhoods. She watched the lights of small stores and apartment buildings pass by the window as her thoughts settled into a quiet determination. The future ahead was still uncertain, but it no longer felt lonely. 2 heartbeats had connected 2 very different lives, and with each passing day the path between those lives was becoming stronger. When she finally stepped off the bus near her apartment building, the night air felt calm and steady around her. She walked the short distance home with quiet confidence, knowing that the journey she had begun would require patience, strength, and trust. And somewhere across the city, Ethan Caldwell looked out at the same night sky, while the responsibility he had accepted earlier that week continued shaping the choices he would make next. Morning arrived with a gentle gray light stretching across the Chicago skyline, the kind of calm autumn morning where the city seemed to pause briefly before the rush of the day began. Aaliyah Brooks stood by the kitchen window of her apartment, holding a warm mug of herbal tea while looking down at the quiet street below. A few early commuters walked toward the bus stop, their breath visible in the cool air. The world outside continued its ordinary rhythm. Yet for Aaliyah, the morning carried a deeper awareness than it had only weeks before. On the small kitchen table behind her rested the envelope containing the ultrasound images from the previous appointment. She had looked at them again before going to bed the night before, studying the faint outlines that represented 2 lives slowly growing stronger. The thought did not frighten her anymore. Instead it brought a calm determination. Across the city, the top floors of Caldwell Global Ventures were already alive with activity. Assistants moved quickly between offices, digital screens displayed schedules and financial updates, and the quiet sound of business conversations drifted through the glass corridors. Ethan Caldwell stood near the tall windows of his office, looking down at the river that curved through downtown Chicago like a silver ribbon. The morning sunlight reflected off the water, sending small flashes of light across the buildings. His phone buzzed on the desk behind him with a new message. Daniel Harper's name appeared on the screen. Ethan picked up the device and read the brief note. The properties near the lake are available for viewing this afternoon if you and Ms. Brooks would like to see them. Ethan considered the message for a moment before replying. Schedule the visits for tomorrow. She should have time to prepare. After sending the message, he placed the phone down again and returned his attention to the city below. Responsibility had begun to shape his decisions in ways he had not expected. Not in dramatic ways that would appear in headlines, but in the quiet adjustments of daily priorities. Meanwhile, Aaliyah finished her tea and gathered her bag before heading toward the community center where she worked. The walk to the bus stop felt peaceful, the crisp air carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves from the small trees lining the street. She stepped onto the bus and found her usual seat by the window, watching the neighborhoods pass as the vehicle moved steadily toward downtown. The routine felt familiar, grounding. At the community center, the morning unfolded with its usual pace. Families arrived with questions about housing programs and healthcare assistance. Volunteers organized stacks of forms while the phone at the front desk rang every few minutes. Aaliyah moved through the work with calm focus, helping a father understand an application process while guiding a young mother toward resources for childcare support. The work had always mattered to her, but now it carried an even deeper meaning. Every parent she helped reminded her of the responsibility she was preparing to embrace herself. Late in the morning, Jasmine approached her desk holding 2 cups of coffee. She set one down in front of Aaliyah with a friendly smile. "You look like you are thinking about something important again," Jasmine said. Aaliyah smiled softly as she accepted the cup. "Life has been giving me a lot to think about." Jasmine leaned against the desk curiously. "Is it good thinking or stressful thinking?" Aaliyah considered the question for a moment before answering. A little of both, she said honestly. Jasmine laughed lightly. That usually means something interesting is happening. Aaliyah did not elaborate further, but her smile remained thoughtful as she returned to the paperwork in front of her. A few hours later, Ethan's car moved quietly through the downtown traffic toward the community center. He had decided to visit in person rather than call again. The driver pulled to the curb outside the building, and Ethan stepped out into the cool afternoon air. The modest brick structure looked very different from the towering offices he usually occupied, but he appreciated the sense of purpose it represented. Inside the center, the receptionist looked up briefly as he entered, her expression polite but curious. Ethan approached the desk calmly. "Good afternoon," he said. "I am here to see Aaliyah Brooks if she is available." The receptionist glanced toward the open office area and nodded. "She is finishing with a client, but I will let her know you are here." A few minutes later, Aaliyah stepped into the hallway, surprised but not unsettled to see Ethan waiting near the entrance. "You came here," she said with a hint of curiosity. Ethan nodded politely. "I hope that is all right." Aaliyah glanced around the center where families and volunteers continued their work. "It is unexpected, but it is all right," she replied. Ethan gestured toward the door. "I did not want to interrupt your responsibilities, but I wanted to speak with you about something important." Aaliyah nodded and stepped outside with him onto the sidewalk where the afternoon sunlight filtered through the nearby buildings. "What is it?" she asked. Ethan spoke calmly. "I arranged visits to several properties near the lake. Quiet neighborhoods with access to healthcare and good schools. I thought you might want to see them." Aaliyah listened carefully before responding. "You are moving quickly." Ethan acknowledged the observation with a slight nod. "Only because I want you to have time to consider every option before the babies arrive." Aaliyah folded her arms thoughtfully while looking down the street, where traffic moved slowly through the intersection. "Tomorrow afternoon?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "If that works for you." She considered the offer before giving a small smile. "Tomorrow afternoon is possible." Ethan's expression softened with appreciation. "Good." The conversation paused briefly while a cool breeze moved through the street, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees. Aaliyah studied his face for a moment before speaking again. "You know this is not just about houses or schedules," she said quietly. Ethan met her gaze with understanding. "I know." Aaliyah nodded once. "It is about building a life that makes sense for everyone involved." Ethan's voice remained calm but sincere. "That is exactly what I hope we are doing." Aaliyah's expression relaxed slightly as she looked toward the busy sidewalk where families passed by pushing strollers or carrying grocery bags. Life continued all around them, ordinary and steady. Yet in that moment, she felt something new beginning to form. Not certainty, not perfection, but the quiet structure of a shared future. "Then we will see those houses tomorrow," she said gently. Ethan nodded once more. "Tomorrow." And as they stood together on the sidewalk outside the community center, the afternoon sun drifting slowly toward the horizon, both of them understood that each step forward was slowly turning an unexpected moment into a carefully built path for the two small lives that would soon arrive. The following afternoon arrived with a clear sky stretching wide above Lake Michigan, the sunlight reflecting off the water in long silver waves that shimmered against the shoreline. Aaliyah Brooks stepped out of the black sedan that had arrived to pick her up from the community center, her eyes moving slowly across the quiet residential street where tall trees lined the sidewalks and elegant townhouses faced the lake. The air carried a fresh breeze coming off the water, cool and steady, and the distant sound of gulls echoed softly above the city noise. Ethan Caldwell stepped out of the car a moment later, closing the door behind him before walking around to join her on the sidewalk. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The neighborhood felt peaceful compared to the busy downtown streets where they had met earlier in the week. Aaliyah studied the surroundings with thoughtful curiosity rather than excitement. She had learned long ago that appearances alone did not define the comfort of a home. Ethan noticed the quiet way she observed the street, the houses, the rhythm of the area. "This neighborhood is called Lincoln Park East," he explained calmly. "It is quiet, close to the lake, and within 15 minutes of several major hospitals." Aaliyah nodded slowly as she looked toward the lake where sunlight danced across the surface of the water. "It is beautiful," she admitted. Ethan gestured toward the townhouse they were about to see, a warm brick building with tall windows and a small front garden filled with autumn flowers. Shall we? He asked politely. Aaliyah nodded and walked with him toward the entrance. Inside, the house felt open and bright. Large windows allowed the afternoon sunlight to fill the living room, and the soft wooden floors gave the space a warm feeling that contrasted with the cool air outside. A real estate agent greeted them with a friendly smile before stepping aside to allow them to explore at their own pace. Aaliyah moved slowly through the living room, running her hand lightly along the back of a chair as she observed the details of the house. The space was elegant but not overwhelming. It felt quiet and steady, the kind of environment where children could grow without the constant noise of city traffic. Ethan followed a few steps behind, watching her reactions rather than trying to influence them. There are 3 bedrooms upstairs, he said gently, and a small study that could easily become a nursery. Aaliyah glanced toward the staircase before walking toward the large kitchen where sunlight reflected softly off the marble counters. The room looked out over a small backyard where a tree had begun dropping golden leaves onto the grass. She imagined for a moment what the space might feel like with the laughter of children echoing through the rooms. The thought was both surprising and comforting. Ethan leaned lightly against the doorway, observing the quiet expression on her face. You do not have to decide anything today, he reminded her calmly. Aaliyah turned back toward him with a faint smile. I appreciate that. They moved upstairs together where the bedrooms were bright and spacious. One room overlooked the lake in the distance, the water visible through the branches of the tall trees outside. Aaliyah paused by the window and watched the sunlight shift across the waves. This view is peaceful, she said softly. Ethan nodded. That was my thought as well. Aaliyah folded her arms thoughtfully while continuing to study the room. It feels different from where I live now, she admitted. Ethan spoke carefully. Different does not have to mean disconnected. Aaliyah looked at him with curiosity. What do you mean? Ethan walked toward the window beside her. Where you live now reflects your independence, he said. Where you live next should reflect your future. The words carried quiet sincerity. Aaliyah considered them carefully before responding. A future should never erase where someone came from. Ethan nodded with immediate understanding. I agree completely. They stood there for a moment watching the lake while the real estate agent waited politely downstairs. The conversation between them continued with the same calm balance that had formed since their first serious discussion at the clinic. After touring the rest of the house, they returned to the living room where the afternoon sunlight had begun shifting toward evening tones. Aaliyah sat briefly on the edge of the sofa while Ethan stood nearby with his hands loosely folded. There are 2 more houses we could see today, Ethan said. Aaliyah nodded thoughtfully. Let us see them. The next property was a few blocks closer to the park, surrounded by quiet tree-lined streets and small cafés where neighbors gathered during the day. The house itself was smaller but carried a warm charm with a front porch and wide windows. Aaliyah seemed to relax more easily in that space, pausing longer in each room while imagining how the future might unfold there. Ethan noticed the difference immediately. You like this one, he said gently. Aaliyah smiled faintly. It feels welcoming. Ethan nodded. That matters more than square footage. They spent the next hour walking through the rooms while the agent explained the details of the property. Aaliyah asked thoughtful questions about the neighborhood, the distance to nearby clinics, and the safety of the area. Ethan listened quietly, appreciating the careful way she considered every aspect of the decision. By the time they stepped outside again, the sun had begun lowering toward the horizon, casting long golden reflections across the quiet street. The evening air felt cooler now, the breeze carrying the faint scent of nearby trees. Aaliyah looked back once more at the house before turning toward Ethan. I can imagine raising children here, she said softly. Ethan's expression warmed with quiet satisfaction. Then it deserves serious consideration. They walked slowly toward the car waiting at the curb. The city skyline was visible in the distance, glowing softly under the evening light. For a moment neither of them spoke, both reflecting on how far the conversation had come since the day they first sat together in the clinic. Finally, Aaliyah broke the silence. When all of this began, she said, I expected everything to feel uncertain. Ethan looked at her with curiosity. And now? Aaliyah smiled gently as she looked down at her hands resting over her stomach. Now it feels like something that can be built carefully. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding the meaning behind her words. That is the best kind of future, he replied. As they stepped into the car and the vehicle pulled quietly away from the curb, the evening sky above Chicago deepened into shades of orange and blue. Somewhere beneath that vast sky, two small heartbeats continued growing stronger with each passing day, quietly guiding the choices of the two people who were learning how to build a shared path forward. The evening sky over Chicago deepened into shades of amber and violet as the car carrying Aaliyah Brooks and Ethan Caldwell moved smoothly along the quiet streets near Lincoln Park. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting soft golden circles across the sidewalks where people strolled beneath tall trees that had begun shedding their autumn leaves. Inside the car, the atmosphere was calm. The warmth of the vehicle contrasted with the cool air outside, and the steady motion of traffic created a peaceful rhythm that allowed both of them a moment to reflect on the day. Aaliyah looked out through the window as the neighborhoods passed by. The houses they had visited still lingered in her thoughts, especially the smaller one near the park with the welcoming front porch and wide windows. It had not been extravagant or overwhelming. Instead, it had felt comfortable, the kind of place where everyday life could unfold naturally. Ethan sat beside her quietly, watching the city lights glide across the glass. He did not interrupt her thoughts, understanding that decisions about a future home required space and patience. After a few minutes, he spoke gently. "You seemed particularly comfortable in the second house." Aaliyah turned slightly toward him and nodded. It felt more like a place where people actually live their lives. Ethan gave a small, thoughtful smile. "That was my impression as well." The driver turned onto a wider avenue where the city skyline appeared in the distance, glowing against the evening sky. For a moment, the tall buildings looked almost peaceful from afar, their lights reflecting softly across the river that cut through downtown Chicago. Aaliyah rested one hand lightly over her stomach as she watched the skyline. The quiet movement had become instinctive now, a small gesture of awareness that two lives were growing stronger every day. Ethan noticed the movement and allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. For years, his life had revolved around strategy meetings, international travel, and decisions that affected thousands of employees. Yet the responsibility he felt now was different from anything he had experienced before. It was personal in a way that no boardroom decision could ever be. The car eventually turned onto the street near Aaliyah's apartment building. The neighborhood was modest but familiar, with warm lights glowing in the windows of small restaurants and corner stores. When the vehicle slowed to a stop near the curb, Ethan stepped out first before walking around to open the door for her. The cool evening air brushed across the sidewalk as Aaliyah stepped out and looked up at the familiar brick building where she lived. For a moment, they stood quietly beside the car, the sounds of the neighborhood creating a calm backdrop around them. Ethan placed his hands lightly in his coat pockets as he spoke. "You should take as much time as you need to consider the houses," he said. "There is no pressure to decide immediately." Aaliyah nodded slowly. "I appreciate that." She glanced up at the building and then back at him. "This place has been my home for a long time." Ethan understood the meaning behind her words. "And it has served you well," he said. Aaliyah smiled faintly. "It has." They walked slowly toward the entrance of the building where a small porch light illuminated the doorway. Before reaching the door, Aaliyah paused and turned back toward him. "There is something I have been thinking about," she said quietly. Ethan waited attentively. "The house near the park felt right," she continued. "Not because it was impressive, but because it felt like the beginning of something stable." Ethan nodded with thoughtful agreement. "Stability is important." Aaliyah studied his expression carefully. "But I want to be certain that moving there would not create a life where everything depends on you." Ethan responded without hesitation. "It would not." Aaliyah tilted her head slightly. "How can you be sure?" Ethan's voice remained calm and sincere. "Because my intention is not to control your life," he said. "My intention is to support the future we are building." The sincerity in his tone made the quiet street feel even calmer. Aaliyah considered his words before giving a small nod. "Then I will think about it tonight." Ethan smiled slightly. "That is all I ask." The conversation paused for a moment while a gentle breeze moved through the trees along the sidewalk. A few fallen leaves drifted across the pavement, carried by the cool evening air. Aaliyah glanced down the street where children were laughing as they walked home with their parents, the ordinary scene creating a peaceful contrast to the complicated decisions she was facing. Finally, she spoke again. Today felt different from the beginning of this situation, she said softly. Ethan looked at her with curiosity. Different how? Aaliyah placed one hand lightly against the door handle of the building while she answered. At first, everything felt uncertain, she explained. Now it feels like something we are learning to build step by step. Ethan nodded slowly, appreciating the honesty of her observation. That is the best approach. Aaliyah smiled again, the expression warm but thoughtful. I will call you tomorrow after I have had time to think. Ethan gave a respectful nod. I look forward to hearing from you. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway of the building, the soft light inside casting a warm glow across the entrance. Before the door closed completely, she turned once more and gave a small wave. Ethan returned the gesture with quiet calm before walking back toward the waiting car. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb and merged into the evening traffic, Ethan looked out at the city lights stretching across Chicago. Somewhere in a modest apartment building behind him, Aaliyah Brooks was walking up the stairs toward a future she was carefully considering. And beneath that future, two steady heartbeats continued their quiet rhythm, guiding both of them toward choices that would shape the life they were learning to build together. The night passed quietly over Chicago, and by morning a soft pale sunlight slipped through the curtains of Aaliyah Brooks's apartment. Stretching across the wooden floor and settling gently on the kitchen table where the ultrasound photos still rested. The apartment felt peaceful in the early hours, the distant sounds of the city just beginning to stir outside the window. Aaliyah stood near the counter preparing a simple breakfast while her thoughts moved slowly through everything that had happened during the past few days. The visits to the houses, the calm conversations with Ethan Caldwell, and the steady realization that her life was moving in a direction she had never expected. She placed a slice of toast on a plate and sat down at the small table where the ultrasound images lay beneath the soft morning light. For a long moment, she studied the faint shapes on the paper. Two small lives growing quietly, unaware of the complicated world waiting for them. Aaliyah rested her hand gently over her stomach, feeling the calm rhythm of her breathing as she thought about the house near the park. The image of the front porch, the wide windows, and the quiet tree-lined street returned clearly in her mind. It had not felt like a place chosen out of luxury. It had felt like a place that could become home. Across the city, Ethan Caldwell stood inside his office overlooking the Chicago River. The morning sunlight reflected off the water below and filled the room with a soft glow that contrasted with the polished glass walls surrounding the executive floor. His desk was covered with reports and financial updates waiting for his attention, but his thoughts were focused elsewhere. The conversation with Aaliyah the night before remained vivid in his mind. She had spoken with calm honesty, the kind of honesty that could not be rushed or persuaded. Ethan appreciated that about her more than he had expected. His phone rested on the desk beside him, and he glanced at it briefly before returning his attention to the skyline. Decisions in business were often made quickly, guided by numbers and strategy. But this decision was different. It required patience and trust. Meanwhile, in her apartment, Aaliyah finished her breakfast and gathered her things before heading toward the door. The morning air outside carried the cool scent of autumn leaves, and the neighborhood streets were already alive with the quiet activity of people beginning their day. As she walked toward the bus stop, she noticed how familiar everything felt. The small grocery store on the corner, the bakery that opened early each morning, the neighbors walking their dogs along the sidewalk. This neighborhood had been part of her life for years. Yet now she was considering the possibility of leaving it behind for something new. The bus arrived with a soft hiss of brakes, and Aaliyah stepped aboard before taking her usual seat near the window. As the vehicle moved through the city, she watched the buildings pass by, her thoughts settling into a quiet clarity. By the time she arrived at the community center, she had already made her decision. Inside the center, the morning routine had begun. Volunteers organized paperwork while several families waited in the lobby for assistance. Jasmine waved when she saw Aaliyah enter. "Good morning," Jasmine called cheerfully. "You look like you finally figured something out." Aaliyah smiled slightly as she set her bag down near her desk. "Maybe I did." Jasmine leaned forward with curiosity. "Is it good news?" Aaliyah paused for a moment before answering. "It is the beginning of something new." Jasmine grinned. "That usually means it is good." The morning passed quickly as Aaliyah helped several families complete applications and find resources they needed. But beneath the busy routine her mind remained focused on the decision she had reached. Shortly after noon, she stepped outside onto the sidewalk and took her phone from her pocket. The autumn sun warmed the pavement slightly as she dialed Ethan's number. Across town, Ethan's phone vibrated quietly on the desk. He glanced at the screen and saw her name appear. For a moment, he allowed himself a small, thoughtful pause before answering. "Hello, Aaliyah." Her voice came through calm and clear. "Good afternoon, Ethan." The city noise moved softly in the background as she spoke from outside the community center. Ethan waited patiently, sensing that she had called with purpose. "I have been thinking about the houses we visited," she said. Ethan leaned slightly against the edge of his desk while looking out at the river below. "And?" Aaliyah took a slow breath before continuing. "The house near the park felt right," she said. "It felt like a place where a family could grow." Ethan listened quietly, the corners of his expression softening. "Then we should move forward with it," he replied. Aaliyah smiled faintly as she looked down the sidewalk where a few children were walking home from school with their backpacks. "There is one condition," she added gently. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "What is that?" Aaliyah's voice remained calm but firm. "It has to be a place that belongs to the future we are building, not something that feels like a gift I cannot stand on my own." Ethan understood immediately. "Then we will arrange it in a way that respects that," he said without hesitation. Aaliyah nodded, even though he could not see the gesture through the phone. "Good." The quiet confidence in their conversation carried the feeling of a decision that had been made with care rather than pressure. After the call ended, Aaliyah returned to the building with a sense of calm that she had not felt before. Across the city, Ethan set his phone back on the desk and looked once more out at the skyline stretching across Chicago. The future ahead was still uncertain in many ways, but the foundation beneath it had become stronger. And somewhere within that growing future, two steady heartbeats continued their quiet rhythm, guiding both of them toward the life they were now preparing to welcome. Spring arrived gently over Chicago months later, bringing warmer sunlight that stretched across the quiet streets near the park where Aaliyah Brooks now lived. The townhouse that once felt like a possibility had slowly transformed into a home filled with life and anticipation. Fresh flowers sat on the kitchen counter, soft blankets were folded carefully near the living room sofa, and a nursery upstairs had been prepared with calm patience rather than hurried excitement. Aaliyah stood near the wide living room window one peaceful afternoon, watching the branches of the trees outside sway lightly in the breeze coming from Lake Michigan. The neighborhood had welcomed her gradually, the same way the seasons changed without urgency. Neighbors smiled when they passed her on morning walks, and the small cafe on the corner had already learned her favorite herbal tea. The house no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt steady. Her hand rested gently over her stomach as she looked out at the quiet street. The months had passed with careful routine. Doctor visits, quiet evenings, and steady support from the people around her had turned uncertainty into preparation. Upstairs, the nursery door stood open, revealing two small cribs placed side by side near the window where soft afternoon light filled the room. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan Caldwell stood near the large window of his office overlooking the Chicago skyline. The same city that once felt like a landscape of meetings and deadlines had taken on a new meaning during the past months. His schedule remained demanding, but his priorities had shifted in subtle ways. Several evenings each week he drove to the house near the park, sometimes bringing dinner from a local restaurant, sometimes simply sitting with Aaliyah while they talked about the future they were preparing to welcome. The quiet partnership between them had grown naturally, built not on promises spoken quickly, but on presence shown consistently. On this particular afternoon, Ethan left the office earlier than usual. The car moved smoothly through the busy downtown streets before turning toward the quieter neighborhoods near the lake. As the skyline faded behind him, the streets became lined with tall trees and small storefronts where people walked slowly beneath the warm spring sunlight. When the car stopped near the townhouse, he stepped out and looked toward the familiar porch. The front door opened before he reached the steps. Aaliyah stood there with a calm smile that reflected the peace she had found in this new chapter of life. "You are early today," she said warmly. Ethan walked up the steps and returned the smile. "I thought it was a good day to leave the office sooner." Inside the house, the afternoon light filled the rooms with a soft golden glow. Aaliyah moved carefully toward the sofa, and sat down while Ethan placed a small paper bag from the cafe on the kitchen counter. "Tea and pastries," he explained. The owner insisted. Aaliyah laughed softly. "The neighborhood is beginning to like you." Ethan smiled slightly. "I hope so." They sat together for a while, the calm silence of the house broken only by the gentle ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of children playing in the park down the street. The atmosphere felt peaceful rather than expectant, as if both of them understood that the most important moments often arrived quietly. Later that evening, the sky outside shifted into soft shades of pink and blue as the sun began to set beyond the lake. Aaliyah stood slowly from the sofa and placed a hand against the table for balance. Ethan noticed the movement immediately and looked toward her with gentle concern. "Are you all right?" he asked calmly. Aaliyah nodded with a small smile. "Just a reminder that the babies are very active today." Ethan stepped closer, his voice soft with curiosity. "May I?" Aaliyah nodded, and Ethan placed his hand gently over hers. For a moment, they both felt the faint movement beneath her palm, a quiet sign of life that carried more meaning than words could describe. Ethan looked at her with quiet wonder. "They are ready to meet the world soon." Aaliyah smiled. "So are we." Days later, the house filled with an entirely new rhythm. The arrival of the twins transformed the quiet rooms into a place of soft laughter, gentle voices, and the peaceful sounds of newborn life. Two small cribs near the window held the tiny siblings wrapped in warm blankets, while sunlight streamed softly into the nursery. Aaliyah sat in the rocking chair near the window, holding one of the babies carefully, while Ethan stood nearby, looking down at both children with a calm expression that reflected something deeper than pride. The journey that had begun unexpectedly months earlier had become something steady and meaningful. Not a dramatic story, but a life carefully built through patience, respect, and quiet choices made day by day. Aaliyah looked down at the sleeping child in her arms before glancing toward the other crib where the second baby rested peacefully. "Two heartbeats," she said softly. Ethan nodded while looking out the nursery window toward the park where families walked beneath the afternoon sun. "And two futures," he replied quietly. The house remained calm as the sunlight moved slowly across the room, touching the wooden floor and the small cribs where the twins slept. Outside the window, the trees swayed gently in the warm breeze from the lake, and the neighborhood carried on with its ordinary rhythm. Yet inside that quiet home, a new chapter of life had begun, one shaped not by unexpected circumstances, but by the quiet strength of two people who chose to build something meaningful together.